So today I'm here with BGSU Professor Bingman, and he got his Bachelor's of Science at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and his Master's and PhD at the State University of New York-Albany. And he does most of his studies, well, I'll just let him explain that.
Sure.
If you want to introduce yourself real quick.
Sure. As pointed out, my name is Verner Bingman. I am a professor of neuroscience in the psychology department at Bowling Green State University. And I'm here to chat with Brandon about various things that are on his mind. So what's on your mind, Brandon?
So, most of the stuff that you do, I think a good place to start is just a basic overview of the hippocampus and its function.
Okay. So as Brandon has already suggested, my research interests are varied, but they principally revolve around how animals navigate. I mean, that's really at the heart of my interest, is how, for example, migratory birds are able to relocate their nest sites year after migrating thousands of kilometers. How sea turtles, for example, are able to relocate breeding sites after just roaming the ocean for years, and then they're able to navigate back to precisely the same beach where they'll lay eggs, where they laid eggs 3 years before. Migrating whales, monarch butterflies getting to Mexico, these various kinds of really remarkable natural examples of animal navigation. Okay. But my research is, so that's my kind of, if you will, my topic interest, but my research interests basically focus on birds, and in particular homing pigeons and their spectacular ability to return home after being displaced, 100 kilometers to a location they've never been to before, and migratory birds, with a particular interest, a growing interest, by the way, because of the students I've interacted with, and how migratory birds orient their movements in Northwest Ohio, how they respond to the shores of Lake Erie, and things like that. But in addition to understanding the behavioral mechanisms of bird navigation, looking at, again, migratory birds and homing pigeons, those interests naturally lead to a conversation about underlying neural mechanisms. Okay. So probably the more significant research that I've been involved in has looked at the relationship between a particular brain region known as the hippocampus and the navigational behavior of birds. So the question I guess Brandon is asking is, why the hippocampus? Why look at that? Okay, and there are a lot of reasons for that. Some historical, some actually evolving from the experiments that I've been doing. But the principal reason is the following: the hippocampus has been known since the 1950s to be a brain structure that is fundamental for human memory processes, particularly those kinds of personal autobiographical memories that we create during those special moments in our lives. That great birthday party you had when you were 7 years old, the first time you had your heart broken by a partner who left you, those punctuated moments in your life, what are called autobiographical or episodic memories. Okay. And we won't get into the details of the observations that led to this general assumption in the 1950s. But the point is that neurological clinical work that was carried out in humans, okay, led to an interest in trying to come up with an experimental model for understanding the relationship between hippocampus and these personal episodic memory processes. Okay, and what the animal work revealed was actually a little bit confounding, in that there were clearly deficits, impairments following hippocampal damage in animals that were related to memory, but these deficits were principally of a spatial nature. In other words, animals with hippocampal damage seem to display a more specific, not exclusively, but more specific deficit in their ability to navigate space. So rats couldn't find escape platforms, they couldn't find food, monkeys had trouble navigating local space. So there was some kind of special relationship between spatial memories and spatial cognition and the hippocampus in animals. And how do you reconcile then, okay, the kind of the spatial emphasis of hippocampal research in animals, which, by the way, before I forget, actually resulted in Nobel Prize being given to 3 animal researchers that studied the navigational system of the hippocampus. What the popular press referred to as the GPS of the human brain would be the hippocampus. And so it was really the animal spatial stuff that won the Nobel Prize about 3 years ago for those 3 researchers, the Mosers in Norway and John O'Keefe in London. But how do you reconcile this? And the idea, and this may be a little bit too nuanced, but the idea is that space, in addition to being a medium through which we navigate, a medium through which we need to move from location A to location B in efficient ways that necessitate remembering maps of space to support those navigational abilities, also provides an important contextual element to distinguish those personal episodic memories. So, for example, when I think about that 7th birthday party when I had a great time, I got everything I wanted, all my friends were there. Okay, part of that memory is coded with respect to where it took place. What renders that specific memory interesting or memorable or distinctive, actually, is the better way of saying that, that occurred in a particular place as well as a particular time and the events. Okay, so what kind of binds the hippocampus's role in episodic memory and the more human-oriented research, and the hippocampus and navigation, the more animal-oriented research, is that basically the hippocampus is a hub of spatial information processing, and that spatial information processing can be used to support navigation as a form of a map, but it also can provide a contextual cue through which distinctive memories are made distinctive.
So just saying it's a GPS is not very descriptive because it's both intertwined with the emotion as well as...
Not the emotion, well, okay, so it gets a little bit tricky, okay, because certainly any kind of episodic memory will be associated with, basically what makes these episodic memories interesting is that you have a really rich re-experiencing of the event. So it's not only the date of the event, on this day I did this with these people at this location, but it's also a re-experiencing of the emotional content of the moment. Okay, and the question that becomes is, what's the role of the hippocampus with respect to the, if you will, the content of the information of the memory as well as the emotional re-experiencing of that? And the assumption is that the hippocampus plays a more important role in basically the date of the event, the what, when, and where, and the more emotional re-experiencing of the event would be mediated by other brain structures, most notably the amygdala. Okay. So the hippocampus and the amygdala would coordinate the richness of the re-experiencing of these past events, where again the hippocampus would be principally involved in, it took place here, it took place then, it took place with these people, what happened, and the amygdala would be more involved in then basically enabling the expression of the emotions of the moment that came with it.
And the amygdala center where fear and aggression and recognizing fear and aggression in other people.
Fear conditioning, right. So the amygdala, again, where the hippocampus, we might call the hippocampus the hub of spatial information processing, or at least certain types of spatial information processing. Again, not to get too technical here, but more allocentric spatial information processing. What I mean by that is information of space that is external to the body, because other brain structures would be more involved in egocentric space. This would be the parietal lobe, for example. So how does space function in relation to my body? So I grab the microphone. That's an egocentric kind of spatial representation that would be more coordinated by the parietal lobe interacting with the frontal lobes. Whereas Bowling Green is south of Toledo. I mean, that's more, it's not really hippocampal, but it's that spatial relations that are external to the body, that are independent of where I am, would be more hippocampal mediated. But yeah, as you pointed out, you're absolutely correct that the amygdala has historically been involved in fear conditioning, fear learning, also even reflexive responses to fear and things like that, as well as positive affect as well. I mean, the emphasis of amygdala research has been on negative affect, fear in particular. But there is evidence that the amygdala plays a more broad role in the expression of emotions, so not just negative affective states, but also some positive affective states as well, as far as I understand it.
So since we're on the amygdala, when the role of like fear and stuff and like steroids, corticosteroids in your bloodstream, you get kind of a response where, especially in like prenatal environment, you have kind of like the shrinking of the hippocampus, right? And then like the enlargement of the amygdala. It's always the case that when, say, the amygdala grows by like 30% and there's more white matter and gray matter to it, that it has more influence thereby because it's larger. And
all right. So again, let me just preface my answer. Okay, by saying that I am not an expert in this field. Okay, I am not a neuroendocrinologist. So the relationship between peripheral hormones and their influences once they get into the brain and act on the receptors in the brain, their influences, I'm not really an expert on. But the idea is simply, okay, so let me just free associate for a while, and maybe I'll answer your question, maybe I won't. You decide. But we do know that stress, including perinatal stress, prenatal stress even, can have profound effects on brain development. Okay, and that stressful experiences will increase the availability of the stress hormones, the glucocorticoids, which in humans, I don't know specifically what is it, cortisol? I think it's cortisol. The principal glucocorticoid in humans is cortisol, because it's different in different animals, but they're all glucocorticoids. Okay, and these elevated levels of glucocorticoid can have profound effects on brain development. Okay, including volumetric effects. Okay, so for example, stress and anxiety can diminish the effectiveness of the hippocampus in terms of its ability to process information, what I would call spatial information, and the supportive memory. It could potentiate the processing that goes on in the amygdala, increasing anxiety, okay, and that anxiety then can manifest itself as fear in particular contexts, okay. Now, what you see, so there are volumetric influences. Amygdala seems to be harder in organisms, including people that have experienced stress of some kind or another, okay. And the hippocampus can get smaller, I think, maybe. I'm not sure of that, but it certainly becomes less effective, less functional. Yeah, we can say that. Okay, so there are these profound effects. Okay, so what you raised is the kind of simplistic assumption that control is somehow, there's an equivalence between control and volume. And it's not that simple, okay? And when we talk about white matter and gray matter, first of all, white matter is enormously important, because where neuroscience is moving is in the sense of understanding human pathologies, for example, is that there's an increasing understanding that many pathologies, including something like pathological anxiety, okay, is related to a miswiring or an altered wiring of the brain connections. So, for example, okay, pathological anxiety is associated with weaker connections, for example, between prefrontal cortex and amygdala. Okay, so the amygdala is like, again, this is very simplistic, but we'll call it the hub of fear, anxiety. Okay, and the prefrontal cortex as the seat of reason, can modulate irrational anxieties that might be expressed in part through activity of the amygdala. By weakening the connectivity between prefrontal cortex, and this would be white matter, between prefrontal cortex and amygdala, okay, you basically liberate, regardless of whatever the size of the amygdala may be, the controlling influence of the prefrontal cortex and exaggerated amygdala activity is diminished because of that weaker connectivity. So that's where white matter becomes very, very important. So when we talk about white matter, we're not really talking about white matter internal to the amygdala, how the different areas of the amygdala hooked up with each other. Basically, when we talk about white matter, is the extrinsic connectivity. Okay, how does prefrontal cortex hook up with amygdala? How does prefrontal cortex hook up with hippocampus? So in many ways, hippocampus, amygdala, and prefrontal cortex, and there are other cortical areas. Insular cortex is of course important, but let's simplify it. That core network of hippocampus, amygdala, prefrontal cortex basically is influenced by stress. That stress then will impact, result in heightened levels of glucocorticoids. Those heightened levels of glucocorticoids will then influence the connectivity among those structures, particularly in childhood, during brain development, okay, which is why childhood traumas are so profound, in that they can have lifespan effects on how the hippocampus, amygdala, and prefrontal cortex work, leading into lifespan anxieties, lifespan psychological disorders that will just be difficult to manage.
Okay, so back on turning it back a bit on to your research.
Yeah.
What do you see that's implicatable for humans in terms of like hippocampal research?
In birds?
Yeah.
Well, that's an interesting question, because we're always trying to get money from granting agencies and things like that, and certainly if you want to get money from the National Institutes of Health, you have to talk about relevance. Okay, and that's why I get most of my money from the National Science Foundation, which is more interested in basic research than applied research. But certainly there are potential implications for bird research. I'll just give you a couple examples very briefly. But the first point is simply this: the hippocampus in birds is what we call homologous with the hippocampus in humans. What that means is that they have derived from the same evolutionary ancestor, and they have a number of similar properties, both in terms of neural connectivity, neurochemistry, developmental gene expression. They're basically the same structure. They look a little bit different. They certainly, at what we call a cytoarchitectural level, the types of neurons and how those neurons are distributed, is different. You look at the two structures and say these aren't the same, but they are. Okay, so the bird hippocampus as well as the reptile and amphibian hippocampus share numerous properties with the mammalian hippocampus as well as the human hippocampus. Okay, so they're valid models for understanding human hippocampal function. Okay, what those other systems don't have is they don't have the interactions. What non-mammalian systems don't have is an interaction between hippocampus and neocortex. Neocortex is a brain region, a brain structure that's only found in mammals. Much of what the hippocampus does involves in how it coordinates activity with the neocortices. There is no neocortex in birds, reptiles, and amphibians. In any event, but for example, given in birds the salience, given the fact that birds are these supreme navigators. In other words, one can make an argument, whether it's right or wrong. Whether you buy it or not is up to you. But one can make the argument that birds are somehow special with respect to how they're able to navigate space. In other words, how birds represent space, allocentric space, hippocampal-mediated space, is special. Okay, birds. So for some of these food-storing birds can remember the locations of dozens, if not thousands, of different seeds that they hide. So imagine a Clark's nutcracker. This is a jay-like bird that lives in the Rocky Mountains. Then in November, it'll hide thousands of seeds that it'll recover in March when it begins to breed. These are pine seeds, right? And they're able to remember thousands of locations where these seeds are hidden. It's just a spatial memory ability that seems just unimaginable. Most people have a hard enough time finding their keys, right? Imagine remembering 1,000 seed caches 3 months after you hid them. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. But that's just extraordinary. So, what birds can offer then is an opportunity to better understand how a hippocampal architecture. And what I mean by and when I'm using this term architecture in a very generic way, in the sense that how the neurons are wired and their neurochemical profiles and these various things, how does that enable these robust spatial representations that birds are able to have? In other words, can we understand the bird hippocampus and use that as a way to perhaps understand how mammalian hippocampal space operates? Okay, and in fact, perhaps understand how, thinking really a little bit of outside of the box here, not thinking in an undisciplined way, what can we learn from birds that could perhaps be used to improve spatial information process, hippocampal dependent spatial information processing in humans? In another context, I have a graduate student named Vincent Coppola who's done some very exciting research looking at aging. Okay, so again, this is kind of an aside, but Alzheimer's disease, which of course is a profound societal problem, aging population, more and more people getting Alzheimer's disease. It's a very complex neurological disorder, but certainly a principal aspect of Alzheimer's disease is the degeneration of the hippocampus. Again, it's much more than that, but a big part of it is degeneration of the hippocampus. As memory decline proceeds with Alzheimer's disease, that decline in memory is associated with a further degeneration of the hippocampus. Again, it's not all that's going on, but that's a big part of it. It turns out that birds get old too, okay, and their memory declines as well, okay, and this memory decline in birds, of course, would be more robustly present in the context of their spatial cognition, their spatial memories. So, for example, you can use birds to perhaps gain a better understanding of the particular spatial information processing deficits that are associated with aging that might reveal something about how the mammalian human hippocampus, how degeneration of the mammalian human hippocampus leads to spatial deficits, with those spatial deficits then having implications for how memory is processed. Right, so it's a little bit of a stretch. If you really want to understand the human hippocampus, you study the human hippocampus.
It sounds like you're more interested in the science for science sake.
I am a basic researcher. I can talk the talk about how birds could potentially serve as a clinical model for aspects of memory loss and memory function, hippocampal dependent memory loss and memory function, but my heart is not in that. Okay, my again, as I kind of suggested early on in the conversation, my interest in all of this begins with a fascination with how animals are such incredible navigators. I'm a naturalist at heart. I'd call me, if this was ancient Greece, you'd call me a natural philosopher. Okay, I'm certainly concerned about the human condition, but I don't see my role. I don't see my role in what's left of my life in trying to necessarily improve the health prospects of humans. Again, my fascination with this whole thing begins with the wonder of nature. I mean, it sounds like a cliche in some kind of after-school special cliche, but yeah, that's where it begins. So I really want to understand how nature works.
Might as well do what you want, what you like, instead of.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think no, I mean, it's. I mean, I always admire people who are motivated, sincerely motivated, by improving the human condition. Okay, I mean, I buy into the idea that humans are special. Okay, and that human life in some ways is more valuable than animal life. Okay, and that perhaps by exploiting animals we can lead to medical advances that promote the quality of human life. I think that's a good thing, but it's just not my calling.
So real quick, just like 2 minutes, I don't want to keep too long.
Right.
We're running out of time.
Do
you think so if you're going to say that like animals are less valuable, how do you judge? Do you think it's like scalar in terms of like how you experience?
All right, you're right. Okay, so again, yeah, I mean, saying something like the life of animals is less valuable than human life, that's of course very risky in 2018. That statement would offend a lot of people. I would be challenged by that statement, but I still think that the richness of the human brain and what the human brain enables in terms of experiencing life is in some way qualitatively.
You could just say higher, I guess, right?
As someone who is trained in evolutionary biology, I refuse to say higher.
Okay.
I would simply say it's richer. Okay, but so what was implicit in your question is that, okay, are all animals equally diminished in contrast to humans? In my view, again, there are a lot of serious people who would say that there is no difference, and of course. Okay, and I think your proxy for understanding behavioral complexity, psychological complexity, mental complexity, if you will, is always going to be related to something along the lines of brain organization, simplistically brain size. So certainly, primates, among mammals, primates are, probably the differences in the richness of mental experiences between non-human primates and humans is almost entirely rests with our language abilities that non-human primates don't have. But emotionally, cognitively, outside of language, there's probably it's probably very, very close. And I think it's probably immoral to do research on non-human primates. I'm not judging anyone who does, by the way. I'm not judging anyone who does. That's just a personal decision. Where for example, doing a brain manipulation on a chimpanzee for me would be unimaginable. Doing a brain manipulation on a rhesus monkey might be somewhat more palatable. It's a smaller brain, less complex perhaps. But
I think it's pretty valid to say that the quality of experience is how you're going to judge value in terms of how much
but what you don't know is what you don't know. I mean, again, not to get too solipsistic here, but really the only mental experiences that I have any familiarity with are my own.
Yeah.
So I couldn't possibly know. There are no tools or devices that I have available to me that will give me insight into the mental experiences of animals. I don't know. For all I know, a worm has the same rich mental experiences that I have.
But Schopenhauer.
Right, but my point is this: what we know is, though, that the human brain is bigger, more complex, more connections, more areas. We do know that as the human brain degenerates, the richness of our mental experiences diminish. So there is clearly a relationship between the functioning of the human brain and the richness of our mental experiences. Given that our brain is so different from any other animal out there, okay, I mean, certainly then the richness of our mental experiences are clearly different, okay, and again, without any kind of empirical justification for it, presumably more complex. So yeah, I mean, you could get into into a mind game here, trying to draw the line. Okay, so we won't do primates. Will you do rats? Okay, so you won't do, for example, jays or crows because they have large brains, but you're willing to do pigeons. Again, you get into this funny. Okay, you won't do birds and mammals because they have big brains relative to other birds. So snakes are okay. Okay, and then it's a dangerous philosophical trap that, for me, I conveniently not spend too much time thinking about it. I mean, I've done enough brain damage in birds in my lifetime such that if they're, karma-wise, I may in fact be destined for hell, for all I know. Okay. But I still sincerely believe in the uniqueness of the human experience and the validity in medical research that seeks to improve the human condition.